Hi, welcome to Get Lit. I'm Pete Crooks, senior editor and senior writer at Diablo magazine, and we're here at the Walnut Creek Library to interview Meg Waite Clayton, a terrific author from Palo Alto who's had best-selling books including The Wednesday Sisters. Welcome to Get Lit.
Thank you for having me.
So you've had an interesting career. You have a law degree and a published author. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to find author?
I made that great leap.
Okay.
You know, I grew up a huge reader, and I told my 8th grade boyfriend what I wanted to be when I grew up was a novelist. Mm-hmm. But then real life kind of hits, and I lost my confidence and didn't think that it was anything I could do. So looking for something to do after college, I took the LSATs at my father's suggestion and did well on them and decided I probably was meant to be a lawyer. Okay. And I went to law school and practiced law for a number of years and didn't start writing in earnest until I was in my early 30s.
And what did you write about?
I started from the beginning writing novels. Mm-hmm. It's what I read, and so it's what I wanted to write. I wrote a novel, and long story short, it ended up getting me a good agent, not selling to a publisher at that first round, and so I stuck it in a drawer, and then I started writing shorter things. I wrote a number of short stories. The first piece I ever had published was an essay in the women's running column of Runner's World, which was just a little personal essay about running with my dad one time, but mostly novels.
But I remember the first article I had published was an article about living at the Grand Canyon National Park and being so far away from movie theaters for the first time that I would take a bus to Flagstaff to go to the movies.
Right.
And I had an article published in a Flagstaff newspaper about, taking a bus for 2 hours to go see The English Patient.
The most exciting things we write about.
And that was such a thrill to get that article published. So not to belittle the women's running magazine, but wasn't that kind of exciting to get that, see that byline?
It was very exciting. It's Runner's World, which is the most read running magazine in the country, and it happened to come out. The issue that I was in happened to come out over the summer when I was traveling, and so I was in all these different airports, and every airport I was in, there was the magazine with my byline in it, and it was quite a moment.
Yeah,
and I remember very distinctly when the editor's name, who accepted the piece, her name was Christina Negrin. It was a piece I wrote. It was a 1,000-word piece. It had exactly one place it could have run, which was in the Runner's World Women's Running column. And when she called a few days after I'd submitted it, and at the time I was submitting short stories, which I would submit and I would not hear, and I would not hear, and 6 months later I would get a form rejection saying, "We're sorry, this doesn't fit our needs." So when the phone rang and it was her saying they wanted to publish it, it was a big moment. I have 2 sons. They were quite young at the time. They are now, one's in college and the other is graduated. But to celebrate, they went out, they wanted to give me something to mark the occasion, so they went and got me this little gift that I opened that night, and it turns out to be a little thing that's about this big. It's a psychedelic armadillo. And what that has to do with a piece about running with my dad in a running magazine, I could not tell you. I don't think they could either, but it turns out to be a great gift, because every time I see that little psychedelic armadillo on my desktop, I know exactly when I got it and exactly why I got it, and just seeing it reminds me of those really positive emotions.
That's nice. I think a lot of people's reflections on psychedelic armadillos might not be so positive, but yours has a good constructive story to it. Going back to when you were in the 8th grade, what novelists did you read that spoke to you in a way that you said, "This is what I want to do"?
The books, the one book that I really read that made me feel like I wanted to be a novelist was probably To Kill a Mockingbird. That and A Wrinkle in Time, which I read about the same time when I was pretty young, when I was in 6th, 7th grade. They felt like such real stories to me, and they were about, as there wasn't much literature about young girls at the time, but those were 2 books that had young girls as their central characters. And in A Wrinkle in Time, the main character is named Meg, so that in particular appealed to me. And you know, any story like that that's just really beautifully rendered and makes you live in another world transports you. And it's what I wanted to do, transport people in that magical way.
Interesting examples. One of them literally has a transporting effect in it, the Tesseract in Wrinkle in Time, and has this fantasy element to it that is so wonderful book for young readers.
Yes.
And To Kill a Mockingbird is so so realistic. It's a place and time in American culture where an incredible injustice can occur.
Right.
But that book and film, I hear as a favorite, favorite book I've ever read, favorite movie I've ever seen, probably more than any other.
Yeah.
Certainly the film, I know the actress who played young Scout, Mary Badham, we're friends and do screening events together. And we'll do a screening event, and a 12-year-old girl will come up with her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and say, "Mary, my name is Scout."
Yeah.
They've been named for that character.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
to see that kind of impact that a piece of literature has had. Also fascinating that Harper Lee never published another novel.
And then if you look at the book and the movie versions of that same story, they're very different. I mean, the book is very much from Scout's point of view, and the movie is very much from Atticus's story. It's much less Scout's story, so it's interesting to see how the same story told from, kind of looked at from a different point of view makes a big difference.
Had you seen that film before you read the book, or did you read To Kill a Mockingbird before you saw it?
I read the book before I saw the movie. I'm not sure when I saw the movie, because I'm not sure when the movie came out. But I remember that I read the book when I was living in Los Angeles the summer before I started 6th grade.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see if you can have your own impression of who Atticus is, because if you've seen the movie, it's Gregory Peck.
It is, absolutely.
So we're in 2013. This is a decade now that you've been a published author.
Yeah, it is.
You're right. So tell us about your first book and the experience you had having that first novel published.
Yeah. The first novel was published in 2003, and it was a long process getting there. I started writing in 1992, and I had been practicing law, and I had no idea how to write. So I did what I always do. I found books that told me how to do it. And then I took books that I read and loved. I took Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres and literally cut it into pieces so that I could, each chapter was a separate physical thing, and I could look at it and say, okay, what happened here, and why is this in this particular part of the story, and kind of deconstructed it to learn, try to figure out where the seams were in that book that is really very seamless and lovely. But it took me a long time to learn to write. I had an experience where that first novel that I wrote, which did end up getting published, was taken on. I queried agents a couple of years after I'd started writing in 1994, I think it was, and got a number of agents who wanted to represent it, and I met with one and flipped to New York and met with them all actually and decided which one I was going with, and sat back and kind of prepared to be on the next bestseller list, and for a lot of reasons, including that the book was not quite as good as I had hoped it was at that point in time. It didn't sell to a publisher, so I stuck it in a drawer, and I wrote the Runner's World piece, and I wrote a lot of short stories, and I wrote a mystery novel that is still in a drawer. And then, but that book always, the first novel always was something that, it was a story that I wanted to tell. And so at some point in time I pulled it out of the drawer and I took it to the Squaw Valley Writers Conference. We were not living here yet, we were living in Nashville, Tennessee at the time. But I thought I would either file it in the circular if I didn't get a good reception there, or I don't even know why I took it there, except I didn't want it to be dead. I remember very distinctly when we talked about it in workshop, Bharati Mukherjee was the workshop leader, and she said to the group, let's look at this sentence. What do you all think about this sentence? And the other 12 hands shot up, and somebody blurted out, it's grammatically incorrect. And I thought I would just crawl under the table and go back to practicing law and, suck my thumb and pull my blanket toward me. But Bharati said, yeah, and isn't it lovely that this woman this writer is willing to break the rules in order to have the sentence end where she wants the emphasis to be, which is what I'd meant to do. I'm not sure that I knew that I was breaking the rules of grammar, but and so with her encouragement, I submitted it to the Bellwether Prize. It didn't win, but it was a finalist. And then once it was a finalist, it was a very easy process of getting it published because it kind of had that Barbara Kingsolver, it's a Barbara Kingsolver funded originally. I don't know if it still is or not, but it's a sponsored prize, and so you get her name attached to your book. It's pretty nice.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and then in 2000, a few years later, you have the great thrill for every author of having a best-selling book,
Great
the Wednesday Sisters.
Great Bill. Yes.
So.
Yes.
Take us through that. Where did that story come from, and how did it come to be published? And then we'll get into the success.
It's actually kind of a funny story, that one. The Language of Light, my first novel, sold pretty modestly, which means my mother bought some copies, and a few other people bought some copies. But it sold very modestly. And once you have a first novel that sells very modestly, it can be very difficult to get a second novel published. So I was despairing of ever publishing anything again. But what I do as a writer, the one thing I bring to the table is discipline. So I sit down and write every day. And so the morning the Wednesday Sisters started, all I had was a title, just the Wednesday Sisters, on a blank file in my computer. And I went to sit and write at the Stanford, there's some outdoor tables at Stanford's Trestor Union, and it's kind of a nice place if you're feeling glum to write. And I sat down and started writing in my journal. And the journal entry literally starts, feeling incredibly well run dry today, like I'll never have another word to say. And it goes on for a pretty long time with this little pity party for myself. But that's writing, because I'm writing in my journal, I'm putting words on paper, and that's my only rule for myself, is that I'm sitting there trying to write. And this woman walked across my field of vision. She was wearing a red baseball cap, one of the Stanford caps with a blonde braid coming out the back. And I didn't even see her face. I saw her kind of as she was leaving, but that made me think of something which triggered kind of a whole story coming to my mind. And so it's a pretty funny journal entry to look at, because it starts feeling incredibly well run dry today, and it ends with the summary, with the first two paragraphs, a summary of what the story's going to be, and the first two paragraphs, which have remained pretty close to intact of the Wednesday Sisters. And I told that story once at the Palo Alto Library, and somebody blogged about it the next day and said, oh, well, if I had inspiration like that, I'd be a writer too. And I wanted to say, no, that wasn't the point of the anecdote. The point of the anecdote was that I sit down every day. And there's a lot of times when I sit down and nothing does come, but sometimes it comes. And so that story was, it just wrote. I mean, it was so easy to write, and it was such a joy to write. And that book has just been such a literary blessing for me, everything that's come of it. It's really changed my literary life, for sure. Now,
that book just had this great sort of word-of-mouth marketing campaign where people passed it from one friend to the next, particularly amongst book club members.
Yes.
And I love the Contra Costa Library supports a group called Bookies that raises money for adult literacy programs. They always have a Bookie Awards event at the Lafayette Park Hotel where they pick the book club book of the year.
Right.
And this is one of these books that is included in that event.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the response you got from people who read the book through book clubs, and also about the value of book clubs to authors, to know that there are groups of people reading these books, sharing them and discussing them?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, the book, the books started, the Wednesday Sisters started its kind of journey out into the world with a wonderful team from Ballantine, but we were getting no publicity for it. We couldn't get the San Francisco Chronicle to, pay any attention to us. Almost nobody. I think your magazine actually did a nice review of it, but there was very little attention to it. But the Bay Area booksellers really liked it and started putting it into people's hands. Nancy Salmon from Kepler's down by me, I think she probably single-handedly sold 500 copies or 1,000 copies of that book. And then people started reading it and started telling friends, and that little miracle that you always hope happens. I mean, that's the best way for a book to find its audience, is one friend telling another, read this. And I've just had some extraordinary experiences that have come out of that. You know, there's a group of women in Chicago who read the book and were inspired to do something as a result of it. And so they decided they were going to do the Avon 3-day breast cancer walk, and they contacted me and asked if they could enter under the name the Wednesday Sisters. And so I've got pictures of them with their Wednesday Sisters shirts that they wore for the walk, and it was just very moving. I have had people at book clubs come up to me, or often will ask if they can walk out with me or whatever. Sometimes they'll meet me at my car to walk me in, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm Kath in particular." The character of Kath, I think, has touched a lot of women of a certain age, the age when it was a very hard thing to leave a marriage, and say, you know, I'm Kath. I did that. I did what she did. Or I'm Linda. I did what she did. And it's really, it's really an incredibly moving thing every time somebody tells you that this thing you made up out of nothing touched them and made them feel understood.
Yeah. Those fictional characters become more real than actual friends and relatives that those people have, because they can directly connect. And so personally connect to them.
And personally connect to them, and you can feel with a character in a book, just by reading their experiences, you feel like they understand your experiences, even though they're not even real. You know, it's kind of a funny dynamic, but I mean, that's how I felt with Scout. I felt that Scout is somebody who would have understood me, because we were a lot alike in a lot of ways. We had big brothers who we adored and admired and could take us or leave us in some ways, but were really wonderful guys. And you connect. You connect. So.
That's fascinating. So how long did that run last, from sitting down at Stanford with your journal to are people still talking to you about the Wednesday Sisters?
People still talk to me about the Wednesday Sisters. It's really lovely. The book ends with an epilogue that kind of brings the characters. The Wednesday Sisters mostly takes place in the late 60s and early 1970s, but it has a sort of epilogue at the end that brings it down to the present. And that was my way of kind of wrapping it up and saying, I'm done with these characters, I'm going to move on to something else. But then I got so many people emailing me and saying, please tell me there's going to be a sequel, that I started thinking, well, what would I do for a sequel for this book? And my publisher started saying, hey, what would you do for a sequel for this book? And so I do have a novel coming out in July called The Wednesday Daughters. And it's mostly the stories of 3 of the daughters of the Wednesday Sisters. But also the original sisters play a big role in it. And 2 of them, Allie and Kath in particular, appear in a very big way in the book. And it's lovely to see that. I mean, every 6 months I get royalty statements, and almost every day still I get an email from somebody, or I get contacted by a book group saying they're reading it, it's God, it just blows me away still.
So in this upcoming book, The Wednesday Daughters, what period of time are we living in there?
So The Wednesday Daughters is set more or less in the present. The events of the book take place. The story takes place. The present-day story takes place in Beatrix Potter's English Lake District, when 3 of the daughters go to take one of the sisters' ashes there to a writing cottage that she wrote in the last few years of her life. And so it explores, it goes back and forth between the present and the past, and it explores the 3 daughters, and in particular, their love lives or lack thereof, and the choices that they are making now. But in the process of that, it further explores the daughters' stories, because the mother's relationships and the parents' relationships definitely inform how the daughters have grown up to see relationships and to think about what to expect, what to want, what to work for. So, so yeah, it's mostly in the present, but it goes back and forth between that and the past.
I always, I'm a fan of Armistead Maupin's stories, and I always think it's so delightful how those stories started as a serial in the 1970s in the San Francisco Chronicle and in a Marin newspaper, and they were very much a document of that time.
Yes.
But over 30 and 40 years now, those characters, he's expanded them into the 1980s and how the culture changed then up until present day. Have you filled in all those gaps that haven't been covered on the page? But do you know where all those Wednesday sisters are?
I know where a lot of them are. I'm not sure that I could fill in all the gaps. But to deliver a character in the present, you very much need to know what their history was. So, I mean, I know a lot more about my characters than I write on the page. You know, one of the things I do when I'm writing characters is I call it my character scrapbook, and I do one for each of my novels. And it's literally, you know, like those things you would put together in junior high school, where you wouldn't have done this, but I would, you know, press my little corsage in a book and let it dry and put it in there, and, you know, pictures of my date or, you know, my brothers and I on vacation. So it's like that, but it's a little broader and a little weirder, because it'll have, like, when I'm developing a character, I'll decide that, so like Kath in the Wednesday Sisters has a big chin. My best friend thinks it's her chin, but it's not actually. It's a picture that I saw in a magazine of this woman. I thought, that's the kind of chin that Kath is going to have. This is before I'd, you know, written very much about her. Just cut out just the chin and put it in my little book. I put in scraps of dialogue and things like that. But as a result of that process, I come to know my characters. I know what their offices look like and what their bedrooms look like, even though I won't have a scene in their bedroom, for example. So one of the surprising things about writing the Wednesday Daughters was that in the Wednesday Sisters, these characters were young. One was just a baby, and the other was started out about 8 and ended up the book about 12 years old. But their little personalities, I look back at that book, I thought, oh, I can just make them whatever I want. Look back at that book, and their characters are very distinct, even when they're young. So, so you start with that, and I realized from writing that they were very formed in my mind, even though I didn't even realize that they were very formed in my mind.
And what response did you get from fans of the Wednesday Sisters to that follow-up novel?
You know, it's been really interesting. I would say that there are people who love the For Ms. Bradwells better, or there are people who love the Wednesday Sisters better. And they seem to fall into a different kind of life paths, I think. So the biggest fans of the For Ms. Bradwells have been professional women. I ended up being invited to do all sorts of professional women events that came out of that. I did women's bar events. I did an event for the women's bar in Chicago, for example. And I did law firm business development, women's business development events, where they would throw a big party and invite their women clients and have me speak and serve us all champagne. It's a pretty nice way to, you know, talk about books. It was, whereas the Wednesday Sisters readers tend to be more focused on motherhood and aspiring writers. It's very much kind of a writing group novel. It's a group of friends who meet first discussing books, and then they start writing together. And so it's been interesting to see the different reactions to the two books.
I was just doing an interview with a friend of mine, Rita Moreno, who's a very successful actor, and has just published a memoir about her life. And it was fascinating to hear her talk, for somebody who's been such an external performer all her life, to talk about exploring the writing process. But coincidentally, she also just read the book on tape of Sonia Sotomayor's memoir. And she was telling me all these stories about Sonia Sotomayor and the cases that she's presided over. So it just makes me wonder, since you have the legal background, which Supreme Court justice has had the most interesting life from your perspective and has also presided over the most interesting cases?
Well, it's kind of hard to say on the cases because, there have only been 4 women justices in the court's history so far, and 2 of them are very new. Sotomayor and Kagan, they just have not had the history that Ginsburg or Sandra Day O'Connor have. When I was writing the For Ms. Bradwells, I did a lot of reading about Sandra Day O'Connor. And she is a justice that has fascinated me for a long time. I started law school in May. Michigan has a group of people who start it's called a summer starter. You start in May instead of in September. And she was nominated for the court right after I started law school and took her seat on the court that September. And so that was a really formative period of my life. I applied to law school at a time when no women had ever even been considered for the Supreme Court. And because she was so much at the forefront of that, her life, if you read about her life, it's just totally fascinating. She's just a really interesting character. Doing what she did at the time that she did it is just blows me away that, and she's not, and the way she did it is so interesting because she took time off to have kids. She went to Stanford Law School when there were 2 or 3 women in her class, and when she applied for jobs in California, the only jobs she was given or were offered were jobs as legal secretaries, which you do not need a law school degree for. And so there's a funny little anecdote in her life where she applied to Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, one of the big California firms, and they offered her a legal secretary job. And then William French Smith, who ended up, I think it was William French Smith, who ended up giving her the offer, or calling her for the offer to be Supreme Court. She said, I guess this one's not going to be for a secretary position. She has a lot of humor.
Good for her.
She's a spunky woman. She has a lot of humor. I don't always agree with her politics, and I don't always agree with her rulings, but I really, really admire her.
Good answer. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about your fascinating career and the success, continued success to you with the Wednesday Daughters.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to Get Lit. Make sure to tune in again, and you'll meet all kinds of interesting and delightful Bay Area authors. Thanks for watching.